It is common for the advocates of socialism to specify that they are advocating for democratic socialism. I find this very interesting. In my view, socialism is inherently democratic. Socialism means worker ownership of the means of production. In a socialist society, the class divide between those who operate the means of production and those who own it is dissolved. Socialist society is classless. Worker ownership of the means of production can only be organized democratically. There is no way to organize worker ownership of the means of production that is not democratic. Any other form of political organization will lead to a few wielding power over the workers. It will create a class above the workers and deprive the workers of ownership. It will therefore not be socialism at all. It will be a reinvention of the oppressor versus oppressed dynamic. Socialism is worker ownership of the means of production, and that means the workers as a class, not a few individuals. This necessitates democracy, as democracy is the only way of allowing such a large group to have ownership and control of the means of production. Socialism is inherently democratic. Anyone who believes in non-democratic economic arrangements believes that the workers are too stupid to govern themselves and wants to maintain or establish a class above them. Socialism and the idea that workers are too stupid to govern themselves are incompatible. Socialism and a means of production owning class above the workers are incompatible. This is entirely antithetical to the worker ownership and classlessness essential to socialism. Worker ownership has to be democratic. There is simply no other way that so many people can own the means of production. Any other system will simply create a class system, the very thing socialism seeks to do away with. Socialism is inherently democratic. It has to be. Workers cannot own the means of production in any way that is not democratic. Socialism is democratic. Calling yourself a democratic socialist is like referring to yourself as a nationalist fascist or an internationalist communist. The first half of the label is pointless because it describes something which is inherent to the second half of the label. The problem with this is that it can give the impression that an inherent component of an ideology is in fact not inherent. The issue with this is that it gives the impression that a defining characteristic of an ideology is in fact not an essential component of that ideology. This has a limited tendency to damage people's understandings and create confusion. If you do not understand that socialism is inherently democratic, you do not understand socialism at all. And the specification of democratic socialism gives the impression that socialism is not inherently democratic, because why else would the specification be necessary? This feeds into great confusion around the label and misunderstandings of socialism. Socialism becomes very hard to understand when, upon being introduced to it, you are given the impression that it is not inherently democratic, when in fact socialism is necessarily democratic. To invoke my earlier example, if you were introduced to the conceptions of communism and fascism by people telling you that they believe in internationalist communism or nationalist fascism, you would naturally become confused. The specification would give the impression that inherent, essential, and significant components of these ideologies were in fact not so. The specification would distance the ideology from its defining components by giving the impression that they are not essential. This would make the ideology much harder to properly understand. Rhetorically, there are issues with using the term democratic socialism. It can give the impression that socialism is not inherently democratic. This deprives socialism of a significant defining characteristic and makes it harder for people to understand. In saying that, many people hold the mistaken belief that socialism is authoritarian, either inherently or at least with great frequency. It is not unusual for people to hold this sentiment. In fact, it is very common. A century of socialism being appropriated by authoritarians and the hard work of conservative propagandists has seen to that. Specifying democratic socialism can be rhetorically valuable because it will prevent people from being left with the impression that you are an authoritarian. The last thing you want is for people to think that you are an authoritarian. That is the opposite of the message you should be wanting to send. Specifying democratic socialism can be valuable. It can make it clear that you are not an authoritarian to people who would have considered you an authoritarian had you not used the word democratic. An important component of rhetoric is remembering that people use very different definitions to you. In order to communicate clearly and effectively, you must either understand and use their definitions, or ensure that they understand yours. We are faced with a difficult rhetorical task. We must try to simultaneously stress that socialism is democratic, while not giving the impression that it is not inherently so by specifying that our version is. We have to help people understand that not only is our socialism democratic, socialism has to be. Socialism as a concept is closely tied to democracy. We must not simply stress that our socialism is democratic, we must stress that socialism broadly is democratic. Anything that claims to be socialism that is not democratic is not socialism at all. Philosophically, the specification of democratic socialism is nonsensical, as socialism is inherently democratic. Rhetorically, things are more complex. We must communicate that socialism is democratic, but we must not do this in a way that leads people to think that socialism is not inherently so. If you think that socialism is not inherently democratic, you missed the point of socialism. Alternatively, perhaps it is time to retire such labels altogether. Perhaps we should pursue the same ideas but under a different name, one that does not bear the stains of historical horrors and decades of anti-leftist propaganda. A hideous historical record of appropriation by reprehensible authoritarians and a massive amount of conservative propaganda arguably makes the socialist label a steadily sinking ship. In getting on board, we doom ourselves. Perhaps as a label, socialism is akin to rhetorical suicide. Perhaps we need to find a new term, one without such a severe taint.